Hi, this is Donnie Alexander from the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves. Let me know if you can't hear me, but I'm here today with Rob Bayless from Yale University and Charlie Parker from Climate Focus. Rob will be presenting first, but we're here because at the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, we commissioned some studies to look at the connection between cookstoves and REDD+. And so we're going to be presenting some of that work here today. So Rob, if you want to start, that sounds great.
And this is Breen, and let me just go through a few logistics first here. Thank you, Donnie, for that introduction. So welcome to today's learning session on Clean Cookstoves and REDD, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns, and I'm a manager for learning and communications. And as Donnie just mentioned, our presenters today are Rob Bayless of Yale, Charlie Parker of Climate Focus, and Donnie Alexander of the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves. And I'd also like to add that World Wildlife Fund does work on clean cookstoves, most notably in Nepal. However, our colleague Uwan from Nepal was not able to join the webinar today due to some technical challenges, but after the session I will send a link with more information about WWF's work on that in Nepal. So before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. And for those of you who have joined our sessions in the past, this will look familiar. So thank you for your patience as we go through it. But yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few hours on our YouTube channel. To get to the YouTube channel, just go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate, or go to youtube.com/WWF Forest Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen via your computer, or you can dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer, this is sometimes caused by having too many internet windows open. So feel free to close any unnecessary browser windows or programs running in the background, and that usually solves the issue. Or you can always join us by phone. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send Jenny Guzman a chat message via the chat tool if possible, and she'll try to get it sorted out. And finally, questions are absolutely welcome. Because we have a few presenters on this session, if possible, please indicate whether your question is for Rob, Charlie, or Donnie. We're all in different offices right now, so that will make it a bit easier to sort out who can best answer this question. You can submit your questions using the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. And after the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email to the YouTube link where you'll find the recording of this session. So thank you again for joining us, and with that, we'll get started. And as Donnie said earlier, these are the topics we'll be going through on this presentation. And at this point, I will let Rob take over. So Rob, please go ahead.
Great, Brian, thanks very much. Hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to discuss a project that was funded by the Global Alliance that I did with some colleagues. I'll name them now so I don't forget. Omar Macera at the National Autonomous University in Mexico, and his colleague Adrian Goulardi at the same university, and Rudy Drigo, who I believe is registered listening online and maybe can chime in later during the Q&A. So if you can see the slide now, we're looking at this very basic question: how sustainable are traditional wood fuels? And by traditional wood fuels, we mean fuel wood or moderately processed wood like charcoal that's utilized all around the global south. If you've been following this issue, I'm trying to click and I'm not seeing in advance. There we go. If you've been following this issue for some 30 years, it's been on the policy agenda with varying degrees of interest from different funding agencies. And if we go back to its first emergence as an issue in the 70s and 80s, wood fuel demand was considered to be a major driver of deforestation, and that's exemplified by some of the publications that I have up on the left-hand side of the slide. It was called the Other Energy Crisis, in a report that got a lot of traction from World Watch in 1975. From a report from FAO, it was implicated, leading to treeless wastes in peri-urban areas in many parts of Africa. And this led to numerous interventions, most of which were not successful. And by the 1990s, a kind of counter-narrative to this crisis narrative of fuel, wood, and deforestation had developed that challenged the direct link between wood fuel and deforestation. And this counter-narrative noted that in many cases, deforestation was more likely to be driven by demand for agricultural land, farming, pasture, rather than unsustainable fuel wood harvesting. This also got some traction, but primarily among researchers and academics, and not so much among policy. If we fast forward to today, and we look at current research, we see the issue is still not settled. So looking at some recent research, we see that they come up with different kinds of conclusions. One study found that wood fuels are not a significant cause of deforestation and provide important livelihood opportunities, and this was from Botswana. However, a study in India says that wood fuels are causing severe deforestation. From Tanzania, they're driving wave fronts of degradation. However, in Mali, wood fuels are adapted to changing circumstances and likely to provide continued cheap fuel supply. So these different conclusions coming from different methodological approaches and different geographical regions suggest that we should probably avoid trying to broadly generalize about the environmental consequences of wood fuel and instead examine the specific geographical context in which wood fuels are produced and consumed in order to understand how specific circumstances give rise to different outcomes. Before I go on to describe our specific study, I'll note that others have weighed in on this question. So if we look at the IPCC, which is the global arbiter of all things carbon and energy, we see that if you dig through Working Group 3 and you get to Chapter 11 and find page 82 where this is discussed, they say this: an unknown fraction of global traditional biomass is consumed in a non-environmentally sustainable way, in other words, unsustainably, leading to forest degradation and deforestation. So the IPCC itself doesn't know how much greenhouse gas emissions to attribute to wood fuels, which is the main energy source for 40% of the world's population. Also, incidentally, the largest source of potentially renewable energy currently being utilized. Other people have also weighed in on this, and perhaps we have some stakeholders in this area listening in. And if we look at other people who have analyzed wood fuel sustainability, the concentration of effort is focused on carbon offset projects that are seeking to reduce unsustainable wood fuel consumption. So along with some colleagues of mine, we went through hundreds of documents from projects located in dozens of countries around the world, representing Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. And these studies collectively estimate that about 90% of wood fuel consumption is unsustainable. These studies are mapped out roughly on the map you see on the slide presented. What we can conclude from this is that they're estimating roughly 8 to 9 out of 10 trees harvested for wood fuel do not regenerate. Now, if you study forestry, or you study land use and land management, you know that when you remove trees, the propensity is to actually regenerate unless you take measures that specifically prevents that. Now, sure, you can overharvest, but my colleagues and I felt that this estimate was always a bit high. It's high for numerous reasons, and we can get into that during the Q&A. So we were charged with trying to find out what's a more realistic figure and how can specific geographic circumstances that's linking up the landscape's ability to regenerate and specific local demand, how do those two converge to give a more accurate figure of wood fuel sustainability? So these are the main questions that we were trying to address. This overarching question, how sustainable are traditional wood fuels? And then a couple of questions nested within that. If there are hotspots, where are they located? How many people might be affected? And what are the climate impacts? And what is the potential for mitigation in the sector? So this map shows the scope of the project. We did a global analysis that covered all of the developing regions where wood fuel is utilized. The approach is based on the wisdom methodology that's developed by my colleague Rudy Drigo together with Omar Macera over the past 10 years. This represents the first global assessment of traditional wood fuel sustainability. It covered 88 countries and our unit of analysis was the first subnational unit, so depending on the country, a province, a state, a department, and we had nearly 1,500 individual subnational units in the study. In addition, we're doing 3 in-depth intermediate and local level case studies, and those are represented by the red circles on the map. One is located in Honduras, one in Kenya, and one in South India in the state of Karnataka. I'll only be presenting today the results of the global study. The subnational studies are still, or national and subnational studies are still underway. Okay, so I'm not going to go into any of the details. We have a publication that describes in detail the methodology that we used, and of course I'm happy to field any questions about it as we go. But essentially, the wisdom methodology looks at wood fuel supply and wood fuel demand. It takes into account subsistence use at a local level and also commercial use, which we assume can be from an extended region. And it identifies deficit areas by looking at imbalances between supply and demand, both in terms of subsistence and in terms of commercial utilization. What we found by looking at these imbalances is that the total non-renewable biomass harvest is between 367 and 457 million tons per year. That represents roughly 30% of the overall wood harvest, which was about 1.2 billion tons per year. These are all expressed in terms of dry matter. So, in other words, at a global level, the fraction of total non-renewable wood fuel, non-renewable biomass in the form of wood fuel is between 27 and 34%. The range here is a function of various assumptions we had to make. There are a lot of uncertainties, as you might imagine. Uncertainties about the rate of growth, about the role of plantations, planted wood in certain places, and others. Okay, if we try and ask what are the climate impacts here, if we look at just the burning of this wood fuel, we know that combustion, which is a combination of releasing a combination of CO2 plus a number of short-lived climate forcers like methane, carbon monoxide, and aerosols. Combustion emits about 2.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. Roughly 3/4 of this is in the form of CO2, and the balance is in the form of black carbon aerosols and other forcers that I just mentioned. However, if we estimate approximately 70% of the global wood fuel harvest is sustainable, that means a bulk of the CO2 is actually sequestered by the next generation of biomass regrowth. Then regrowth stores between 1.6 and 1.8 billion tons of carbon per year. That leaves net emissions between 1 and 1.2 billion tons of CO2. If we compare this to global emissions of all greenhouse gases, this comes to roughly 2% of global emissions. If we looked only at forest and other land use emissions, this is 4 to 8% of forest and other land use emissions. Okay, we could also ask what's the mitigation potential. Now, here, just to have some numbers to go by, we looked at the Global Alliance's objective, which aims to deploy 100 million stoves by 2020. What we assumed was that these stoves could be successfully deployed. That means they get 100% uptake using the best available technology. This is, of course, as optimistic as one can get. If this were to happen, 100 million stoves using the best available technology, then we would find emissions could decrease by 100 to 160 million tons of CO2 per year. This range is a function of where the stoves are actually adopted. As you just saw in the previous slide, geography matters. Okay, some areas are characterized by hotspots where FNRB is very high. Other areas are characterized by relatively low FNRB. So if they're adopted in a high non-renewable biomass utilization region, then we get higher emissions reductions. But if they're adopted in areas that are characterized by low non-renewable biomass utilization, then we would get lower impacts. Okay, so just to wrap up, and I'll pass off to Charlie, we find about 1/3 of global wood fuel harvest exceeds sustainable yields. That's 27 to 34%. This is much lower. This is 60 to 70% lower than estimates used by household energy projects, which the median estimate was about 90%. So that means collectively, as a community, we're likely overestimating the emissions reductions from projects. Okay. We find about 275 million people live in wood fuel hotspots, These are concentrated, and I should have said this when I had the map up. Hotspots are concentrated in East Africa with some pockets in West Africa, and in South Asia. There are parts of Pakistan where the non-renewability is quite high, and parts of Nepal. Currently, we're trying to validate these results. One of the ways we're doing this is by looking at our national and subnational studies, which allow us to use much more detailed place-specific data, and we can compare those results to the global study. We do have the global study that's been peer-reviewed and published, which allows for some scrutiny and some feedback. And we're also doing very local place-based studies, which are represented. You can see the map on the lower right, where we're actually tracking people's fuel wood consumption, and it gives us a better sense of whether or not we're making valid assumptions in our global model. So I will end on that point, and I welcome any questions later. I'm happy to pass over to Charlie, who will describe the project that he did.
Thank you. I think you can all hear me, so I'll go ahead. So we also were working with the Global Alliance of Cookstoves. We came at this from a different angle to Rob, and we built on a lot of Rob and his colleagues' data to really sort of piggyback off the excellent work that he just presented to you. The way we came at this is we were thinking about how much of our priority in REDD we should focus on Cookstoves. And this is a question that I've been asking for some while and not really finding any good answers on. And how much of our REDD finance should we be channeling towards Cookstoves, and how much of our REDD efforts should we be channeling towards Cookstoves? And really that began with an understanding of how big a part of the problem are Cookstoves in emissions from deforestation, degradation, and what are we currently doing to address that. So our study, we looked at three main questions. The first one was how much does wood fuel contribute to global forest emissions, and that was, as I said, building on a lot of Rob's work in terms of understanding the total emissions from fuel wood use as a starting point. The second question was how many of those emissions can be mitigated. We looked at a variety of supply and demand side measures to mitigate emissions, and thirdly, to conclude, what role can REDD play in supporting Cookstove and wood fuel interventions? So the way we developed our comparison and our understanding, I think a big part of this problem, as Rob has highlighted, is we don't really know where wood fuel emissions are coming from. Are they a part of a degradation process? Are they part of a deforestation process? But what we do know is that they're probably not accounted for in most of our current estimates of REDD+. So what we did instead was we compared like for like. We had Rob's calculations of total emissions from wood fuel use in the tropics, which is where we focused our study, and we compared it with two studies, one by Vicini, that was an estimate of carbon stocks in pantropical forests, and another one by Nancy Harris and others, which was an estimate of emissions from deforestation, gross emissions in the tropical regions from 2000 to 2005. So we recognize that these things are not comparable, but at least they're measuring the same thing, and they're measuring it in tons of CO2, and these are the two sources that we have for deforestation emissions. So using that, Nancy's study shows that emissions from deforestation account for roughly 3 gigatons of CO2 per annum. So using Rob's figures, and we didn't include black carbon, and we didn't include the other climate forces, we get to this figure of roughly a quarter of emissions from wood fuel, roughly a quarter of total emissions from deforestation are emissions from wood fuel. We compared that to another analysis by Bronson Griscom, and he found that emissions from forest degradation was around 57% of forest emissions, and that was, in Asia that ranged from 25 to 42, so we're roughly in the right ballpark. But as we found the same as Rob. That story and that number differs vastly depending on which countries you're looking at. So our next approach was to look country by country, and we have detailed data using remote sensing from the Harris study on gross emissions from deforestation in the pan-tropical countries. And we can compare that then with the emissions from woodfuel use. So this graph shows, a range on the left-hand side from 0 up to over 9 times of emissions from deforestation are responsible from wood fuel use. So you might ask how this is possible. How can you have more emissions from wood fuel use than you have emissions from deforestation? And I think this speaks to the problem of what we account for under REDD+ and where emissions come from wood fuel use. But essentially we need to include these emissions if we're trying to address emissions from biomass in these countries. And you can see from this map that some countries stand out more than others. So you can see some countries with high wood fuel emissions, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Somalia, a lot of the sub-Saharan African countries, as well as Nepal and India, have greater emissions from wood fuel use than they do from deforestation, based on the study that Nancy Harris did, which is looking at gross forest losses, as I said before. If you look at other countries, the wood fuel emissions are dwarfed by agricultural emissions. So in Brazil, emissions from wood fuel are tiny, less than 5% of emissions from deforestation, and same in most South American countries with a few exceptions. The next comparison was to look at the existing forest carbon stocks in those countries, and this really gave us an estimate of scarcity. So we looked at the Bacini data, which shows how much forest carbon stocks there are in total, and then if we look at the offtake for wood fuel consumption, the non-renewable wood fuel consumption, you can see that some countries are up to 1 and 2% of their forest carbon stocks are being depleted each year through wood fuel burning. And again, it focuses on a lot of the same countries, a lot of sub-Saharan countries. And you can see a few gaps in the data. We didn't have data from Bacini for Brazil or India. And a few countries in Central America stand out too. And if we compare this number, this 1 to 2%, global average deforestation rates are just 0.5% per year. And in these countries, so we're far above that already, and this is just from one source of consumption. So moving on from the emissions from wood fuel use, which we found to be, as I said, around 1/4 of REDD emissions, we then looked at ways to mitigate those emissions, and we looked at 2 approaches. Demand-side options were ways to reduce wood fuel use, so efficient cookstoves, biogas digesters, and so on. We also looked at ways to increase the sustainable supply of wood fuel, and our study focused on afforestation and reforestation techniques, mostly because of methodological issues with other supply-side options. We made a series of assumptions. I don't want you to look at everything on this table. Our figures are based on the high adoption scenario. We assume that a certain percentage of the population adopt more efficient wood fuel devices, cooking devices. And the bottom figure there, the 130 million, we can compare that. It's in the order of magnitude of the Global Alliance's target of 100 million cookstoves by 2020. So our high adoption scenario is where we chose to look at in terms of mitigation potential. At the bottom, we also look at targeting these cookstove devices at users of charcoal. And this is something that we found during the study that I think is an important side note, but has a big impact on deforestation. Charcoal is a more efficient source of fuel, but in terms of deforestation impacts, the impacts of using charcoal versus wood, because of the way charcoal is produced, can have up to 5 or 10 times the deforestation impact. So if we target charcoal users, we can have a bigger impact in terms of reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So based on that, we get this list of countries and the mitigation potential across those countries. This totals to around 200 megatons of CO2 per year. And you can see the majority of the emissions reductions come from just 5 countries there at the top: China, Indonesia, India, Ethiopia, and Pakistan. That's primarily because they are the major users of wood fuel and they have large populations. But across the list, 11 of the 20 countries are sub-Saharan African countries. So moving to supply side, and I'm more than happy to field questions. There's a lot more detail in the report at this bottom. Time constraints, I'm going quickly through these. On the supply side, we used figures that have been created by Zoma on available land for afforestation, reforestation. And again, we took 3 scenarios. Our abatement potential that we show you here is based on the high scenario, which assumes that we afforest and reforest 25% of available land in the countries that use wood fuel. So it's a high assumption. But again, across all the countries we use, it adds up to roughly a figure of 100 million hectares of forest afforested, which is the same as the Bonn Declaration on Forests. So it was in the ballpark of at least policy ambition. So using those assumptions for increasing sustainable supply, again we get a range of abatement potentials. I just want to explain this difference between the blue bar and the white bar. Some of the emissions reductions that we achieve are by improving the sustainable supply of emissions. So, each ton that is consumed is sustainably produced and therefore is an emission and constitutes an emission reduction. That's the blue bar. The white bar is a factor of we will just have more forests that are used for wood fuel production, and the white bar represents the standing stock and the emissions that are embodied in the standing stock of forests, and that is a larger percentage because of the timeframes we're using of the emissions reductions that can be achieved through supply side mitigation. So that comes to a total of 730 megatons of CO2 per year, but as I said, the majority, roughly 500 megatons, or 68%, is from the standing stock of wood fuel plantations. So putting that together, on the left-hand side we see our biomass consumption. It's the figures that Rob showed. We use 450 tons as a simplified estimate of total non-renewable biomass consumption. And then on the middle bar, roughly a quarter of that can be met through demand-side interventions, or reduction of 25% through demand-side interventions. 25% of non-renewable biomass consumption can be met through sustainable supply, and the rest can be offset essentially through the standing stock of forests. Excuse me, I just skipped a slide. So finally, we looked at wood fuel and REDD strategies, and how are countries incorporating wood fuel within their national REDD approaches. And we can see that across the FCPF Readiness Fund, the Forest Investment Program, and the Carbon Fund, more than a half of these countries are somehow integrating wood fuel interventions into their national REDD strategies, which seems like a very positive approach. But if we look in a bit more detail, here we sort of looked at which countries would we want to target in terms of their impact on deforestation through wood fuel use. So we looked at 3 different groups of countries: those with high emissions from wood fuel use on the left-hand side, those with high emissions reductions per replacement cookstove, so essentially high wood fuel users, and then those at the bottom where the wood fuel emissions are a large percentage of their emissions from deforestation. And we can see this sort of overlaps. India, Ethiopia, Brazil, Nepal are the countries we'd want to target if we really care about wood fuel emissions from cookstoves. But only a few of those, just Brazil, Ethiopia, and Nepal, are being targeted through REDD Plus approaches. The rest of them are not in any of the large-scale REDD programs. And finally, if you think about the impact that these programs are having, the green bars here show estimated emissions reductions from either FEARPOR, Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, wood fuel interventions over the lifetime of that financing. and the red bars show annual emissions from wood fuel use. And you can see that with the exception of the Republic of Congo, annual emissions dwarf the total emissions reductions expected under these interventions. So the scale that these programs are working at, largely because of the scale of finance being provided, is far below that's needed to reduce emissions from wood fuel use. So finally, just to recap, we conclude in our study that emissions from cookstoves are a significant proportion of our emissions, around a quarter. Whether it's a quarter of those emissions or an additional quarter, we don't know, but we know that it's a quarter of the total emissions. Additionally, we show that mitigation of cookstove emissions can be a central part of national REDD strategies, especially in those countries with high wood fuel emissions like Ethiopia and Nepal, but that the current levels of finance to reduce emissions from wood fuel need to be scaled up considerably if we're to make an impact in wood fuel emissions. And with that, I'll pass over to Don. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Charlie. I'm Donnie Alexander from the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about, what the Alliance is and why we're interested in REDD+. So, we're a public-private partnership that is hosted by the United Nations Foundation. We have over 1,000 partners, and we were launched in 2010. So we are not one entity deploying cookstoves all over. We have numerous partners throughout the world that we support in various ways. So our vision is really universal adoption of clean and efficient cooking solutions, and our mission is to save lives, improve livelihoods, empower women, protect the environment by creating a thriving global market for clean and efficient cookstoves and fuels, with the key goal of 100 million households adopting clean and efficient cooking solutions by 2020. So one of the things that we're really interested in is understanding the effects of wood fuel use or biomass fuel usage from traditional cookstoves on deforestation and forest degradation. And that is really why we funded these two studies. So like I said, we have over 1,000 partners from donor countries to the private sector, and then also many national partners as well, including Nigeria, China, Bangladesh, and together we're working on this issue of cookstoves and how it affects health, environment, and whatnot. So our goal, or really what we do, is we use a market-based approach to address this. So we're not out there giving out stoves, but really focusing on an approach where people are selling stoves. So we want to focus on strengthening supply, enabling the market, and this includes the research and getting the standards and testing and everything up to where we'd like it to be, and then enhancing demand. So this is just a little bit of this is kind of a busy slide, but I think it kind of shows here some of our projections and impacts in our 8 focus countries. I'm not going to go into this due to the time that we have, but this kind of shows, based on some of the reporting, where we are. And based on time, I'm just not going to go through this here today. So some of our 2015 activities related to REDD+ is we focused on the widespread release of the results of the global mapping study, and that was really, we published a press release and a newsletter and posted it on our website. And then we just released at the beginning of April terms of reference for aligning cookstove and greenhouse gas methodologies. And so those applications are due April 24th. If any of you have more questions, you can go to our website to look at that. And then also we are focusing on engaging with the REDD Plus communities to broker partnerships and enable clean cooking projects funded by REDD Plus finance. And that includes really some of the webinars that we are doing, collaboration with iCraft on a workshop that they have here, that they have in Kenya in May, and then working on discussions on ways to collaborate with FIP and FCPF. So that's really what we're doing in the REDD Plus arena, and we hope to continue focusing on the effects of traditional biomass use for cooking and on deforestation and forest degradation at a global and regional level, and how clean cooking solutions can affect that. So I think now I am done, so I think we can open up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Donnie. So thank you again to our presenters for that overview of those studies and that work. And at this point, we will open it up to questions. So again, as a reminder, please feel free to type your questions in using the question panel or a tool on your GoToWebinar toolbar. And we, I believe, already have a few questions in, so we will get started. Okay, so the first question is for Rob, and this is from Florian. And Rob, the question is, how likely is it that 70% of global wood fuel harvest is sustainable when wood fuel is often harvested for international trade, such as charcoal in East Africa? Rob, can you?
Okay. Yeah, I'm on. So, well, how likely is it? This is the conclusion that we came to, based on the best data that we could dig up. So the question specifically targets or mentions the idea of charcoal and raises East Africa as an example. So recall, 70% is our global figure, okay, and 70% sustainability, 30% unsustainability. I don't know if you can back up the slides.
Sure.
If you can go back to slide 11, which shows the map. One of the main points of our effort is to show that there's a great deal of geographic variability in woodfield sustainability. So Florian notes charcoal in East Africa as an example of perhaps more unsustainable wood fuel than we might find as a global average, and that's true. If you look at the map and focus in on the Rift Zone or the Horn region in East Africa, you can see that that's where some of the shades of red and brown show up. And indeed, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, countries that are known to be charcoal intensive, show up as quite a bit less sustainable than the global average. And they're not that one, the one that had the results, slide 11, I think it is.
Okay, slow going here. This one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So those are what we would consider hotspots, and they're characterized by having a national fraction of non-renewable biomass 50% or greater. So holding charcoal up as an example of potentially unsustainable wood fuel utilization, yeah, we find that those areas tend to fare less well. But keep in mind that charcoal collectively at a global scale only represents about 12% by our calculations of overall wood fuel utilization. Converting into wood equivalent units, accounting for the inefficiencies of charcoal conversion, it's still a small fraction. So when we consider it globally, it doesn't have a great impact. Also, I should add that you mentioned charcoal being traded internationally. I think the bulk of charcoal is utilized within the country where it's produced. So international trade, well, we do see some evidence of it, coming out of the Horn and going, say, towards the Arabian Peninsula, or a little bit of transborder activity within the countries within East Africa, or notoriously over the border from Dominican Republic to Haiti. Overall, there's not a lot of global trade, compared to domestic consumption. At least we don't see evidence for that. So yeah, it's a valid point, but it brings me back to the notion of geographic specificity. And when you average worldwide, you realize that the bulk of wood fuel is, the largest consumers are India and China, where we find relatively sustainable situations. Again, with domestic variability. I would stand by our figure of 70% sustainability, and still 30% unsustainability is something to be concerned about. pass on to the next question.
Thanks, Rob. So let's see, the next question is for Charlie. And so Charlie, this question is about remote sensing-based data. And this is again from Florian, and the question is, remote sensing-based data mining suffers from some drawbacks on forest degradation. Multispectral data does not cover volume of forest and understory well, while radar-based approaches cannot differentiate volume losses in high-volume forests because of radar backscatter saturation. Can you speak a bit to that in terms of data sources and any sort of drawbacks and pros and cons to that data?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you hit on a good point, Florian, and I sort of glossed over this in the presentation, but essentially our comparisons are from two totally different data sets and data types. On the one hand, we have remote sensing data that just shows that forest has changed from some percentage of forest cover to another percentage of forest cover. And there's a threshold for that is defined in the Harris study. And our other data set is based on consumption and use of wood fuel and estimates of how much of that is non-renewable and therefore results in some kind of biomass loss. A lot of things are not the same between those two. They could be coming from areas that aren't defined as forest. They could be degradation that's not visible from remote sensing. They could be a part of the deforestation that we're occurring. There are a lot of sort of nuances that we cover in our report, but I didn't cover in this presentation. So what we've done essentially is just compared the numeric values. And we did that, and we felt that was important because if the numeric values show that, for example, in Ethiopia, the emissions that are occurring because of wood fuel use are equal to or greater than our expected or estimated emissions from deforestation, then we know that it should be a significant part of the solution in those countries. But whether it's a percentage of those emissions or whether it's an additional amount of emissions that haven't been reported, we really can't say. But so we're not trying to suggest that this data is comparable or that we have found these emissions reductions through specific remote sensing technologies that analyze degradation. And that will be a problem if we are trying to use remote sensing techniques, as you said. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Charlie. So the next question is for Donnie, and the question is, are the countries mentioned in the second presentation, so I presume it's Charlie's presentation then, Ethiopia and Nepal, targeted countries for Global Alliance for Clean Cookstove Intervention? Can you speak to that?
Yes, definitely I can. So we have 8 focus countries, of which neither Ethiopia nor Nepal, they are not focus countries, but they are definitely partners. And so we definitely do work in those countries as well. The 8 focus countries were chosen based on a lot of research in the beginning when the alliance was launched, but we definitely do work in Nepal and other places, including Ethiopia. And so I guess the short answer is yes.
Great, thank you. So this is a good question. This probably can go to anybody, I think, out of our 3 speakers today. The question is, many of the assumptions used assume 100% uptake of the cookstoves. Is there research on how effectively people use cookstoves in the long term and how consistently?
So I think I probably am the best person to start with answering that. Rob did that analysis showing what could possibly, what would be the best, best case scenario. We do not expect 100% uptake in real world. There's a lot of research showing that that is not the case. We continue to do research to see, what stoves and fuel combinations and what locations have better uptake, based on behavior change or getting women involved. So the short answer is, no, we don't know. We don't believe that 100% adoption exists everywhere. It is extremely variable and depends on many things, including the cook stove, the fuel type, the location. But I think that's that's a good start to start with the best case scenario to see what we could achieve if there was 100% adoption of these technologies. Do either of you, Rob or Charlie, want to add to that?
I would just say that, sorry, go ahead, Rob.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think one of the big findings for us was that the majority of emissions reductions would come through sustainable supply, which is not a target of the Global Alliance, who primarily are coming at this from a health and livelihoods perspective. So you want to improve the use of wood fuel consumption and burning. But in terms of deforestation impacts, which is the way we came at this particular problem, I think that a lot of the demand needs to be met through increasing sustainable supply, which is something that I don't think gets very much airplay. So I'll just add that to your comments, Donnie.
Yeah, just to jump in, so this is an area of active research, like Donnie mentioned, and it's a major issue. Not only is lack of adoption, troubling in terms of making these kinds of projections and trying to understand the impact of efforts, but adoption without the rejection of the older technology is also a challenge. So that's something that we need to be cognizant of. We can be handing out improved stoves, but still see the traditional stove used in parallel with it, and that's something that should be kept in mind.
Thank you. So the next question, I think probably Charlie is the best to kick this one off. This is from James, and James asks, what is the latest status on REDD+ and revenue from plantations/woodlots used for sustainable fuel supply? And Charlie, as you're answering that, I'm going to advance to the end here with some links to further resources. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I guess that sort of penultimate slide that I showed, we highlighted that roughly 50% of both the Forest Investment Program and the FCPF Carbon Fund have highlighted some form of supply, or that's the one before that, excuse me, have highlighted some, sorry, it's two before that, it's the one before that one, thanks. Yeah, so there's, they've highlighted some form of wood fuel supply or demand approach in their REDD strategies. Specifically on plantations, I know that the Forest Investment Program in DRC and other countries are looking at wood fuel lots, so creating sustainable wood fuel lots. It's in there. It's a part of the sort of country's approaches to reducing emissions. I just think it's in there in a very, very small scale, and is often, in competition with a lot of other drivers and a lot of other factors that are competing with those resources and that finance to reduce emissions from other drivers. That's my short answer.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Donnie. And Donnie, this attendee asks, what carbon offset protocols are in place that you can follow to track emissions reductions for specific projects, if they exist? And what is the basic accounting methodology, and do they account for black carbon emissions reductions in addition to CO2? So I suppose the shorter...
Great, so I'm going to answer part of this, and then I'm going to pass.
Go ahead, perfect.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, please.
Sorry, I was going to answer part of this, and I was going to pass it on to Charlie as well. So at outside of REDD+, there are definitely accounting methodologies that count for this. Gold Standard has methodologies. There are, carbon finance mechanisms, and there is now a new black carbon methodology out by Gold Standard that looks at emissions from Cookstove projects. We just released terms of reference to look at how do we align methodologies for from the REDD Plus side and the clean cooking side. And so we're hoping to be able to look at that more in the future. And I think, Charlie, you can maybe speak a little bit more to the REDD Plus side for this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, in general, these two things have followed different tracks. This is sort of another study entirely, I guess, but you could think of REDD methodologies as incorporating Cookstove emissions and Woodfield emissions, and some of them have aimed to do that. Also, when we think about national level reference levels and national level programs, they could well incorporate accounting of emissions from wood fuel use. But as yet, there's been no formal alignment of methodologies in the carbon markets and VCS and CDM with Cookstove emissions and methodologies for REDD Plus. And as Donnie said, that was something that the Alliance are pursuing that I think is a gap in terms of trying to align these different approaches.
Thank you, Charlie. The next question is for both Rob and Charlie, and this is from Matt, and Matt asks, is the policy implication of the studies that projects should have a lower FNRB rate, 30%, not 85%, or is it that FNRB rates in CDM and VER methodologies should have more specific regional data applied? And for whoever tackles that first, if you want to do us all a favor and explain those acronyms just as a refresher, FNRB, CDM, VER, just for fun, would be great.
You want to go first, Rob?
Sure, I'll take this. Okay, so the acronyms here, FNRB is fraction of non-renewable biomass. This is the critical factor in determining how much carbon emissions reductions to attribute to a given household energy intervention, because it's that fraction that's not absorbed by the next generation of tree growth and is therefore unsustainable and therefore results in additional CO2 in the atmosphere. CDM is, of course, clean development mechanism, VER, voluntary emissions reductions. So these are two different flavors of carbon offsets that exist. So the question specifically was, is the policy implication that the high estimates, the 80, 90% estimates, are not valid, and should we use a 30%? No, 30% is the global figure. The point of this research was to come up with more reliable, geographically specific figures. So what we've done with this subnational level analysis, states, provinces, etc., was come up with specific FNRB values, or fraction of non-renewable biomass values, for given administrative units. So in a given country, whether it's divided into states or provinces, etc., we have now estimates of FNRB for those specific states or provinces. These are, I have to stress, estimates. They're based on the best available data that we could get doing a global scale study. Okay, but no, the 30% figure would only apply in areas where we find that those subnational figures justify a 30% estimate. And again, the data is available, so we have a report that's submitted to the Global Alliance, and we also have a scientific publication. And it didn't dawn on me, I can provide a link for the scientific publication if people are interested, as the main text, plus a whole bunch of supplemental data that explains the sources of data that we used, the underlying assumptions that we had to make, plus all of the results at this subnational level. So lots of tables at the back that are available for anybody to download.
Mm-hmm. I agree with everything that Rob just said, and he is the expert on this. So I would just add that for me, the main policy implication of our paper was that even if these FNRB rates are lower than the CDM versions, and we should definitely use the most accurate scientific ones, the amount of emissions that are occurring from wood fuel use can still be an enormous percentage of both national emissions, total national emissions in these countries that have high wood fuel as part of their energy mix, and they can be an enormous part of emissions from deforestation. So when we're thinking of REDD approaches and how to address deforestation, even with conservative FNRB rates, wood fuel could still be the primary thing, the primary intervention that countries need to be focusing on in their national grid strategies.
Thank you. So the next question is from Santiago, and I think this can go for anybody. And Santiago asks, is it possible to see the same amount of emissions reductions if in these targeted countries wood is used for boilers to fuel electricity generation, and then that electricity is used in electrical stoves? Or is there a difference in how the wood fuel is used in terms of the emissions reductions?
I can take this.
That would be great.
No
I think I probably wasn't stating that very clearly, but it's the question from 10:42 a.m. from Santiago. If that's
Sure. I have the
you.
question in front of me.
Okay.
So I haven't done the calculation. You shouldn't use the same estimations if you're talking about running wood into a wood-fired boiler, making electricity, and then using that to cook. Okay, just because the emissions profiles are going to be quite different. The underlying FNRB assumptions would be the same because that assumes a landscape level approach, basically. So we're looking at wood harvested and wood supplied by the natural environment. So if you wanted to factor in industrial uses, which this would be considered, we already factored that into our assessments. So we look at industrial offtake and we look at subsistence or commercial wood fuel offtake. So that's, the FNRB numbers would be valid unless you have a project at such a scale that it would change industrial industrial demand considerably, but that's a different question. So the FNRB values would be valid. However, the emission factors from the actual combustion processes, et cetera, that would be different. So you'd have to run through a separate set of calculations to do that. Plus, the question itself mentioned something about illumination in addition to cooking with electricity, and that would be a different factor entirely. It depends what kind of illumination you're displacing. But I should also add that in terms of where we've looked at people cooking with electricity, where wood fuel is also heavily used, we rarely find electricity completely displaces wood fuel demand. So this would be one of those cases where you probably find people cooking with electricity in parallel with wood rather than substituting wood.
Thank you. And the next question is going to be our final question. I know we have quite a few we weren't able to answer, unfortunately, but the time is running short here. So the next question is from Kevin, and this is for Charlie and Donnie, and/or Donnie. You mentioned estimates for greenhouse gas emissions reductions associated with the implementation of improved cook stoves. What testing methodologies were used to estimate the emissions associated with specific cook stoves? Did you do water boiling tests, kitchen performance tests, or something else? Can one of you please address that one? And as you are answering that, just so everyone knows, I'm going to be advancing to the final few slides here with some resources just to let that sit on the screen as Charlie and Donnie answer this last question.
Actually, that may be a question for Rob.
Or Rob, yes. Rob, do you
So, I mean,
Okay.
Rob, do you want to?
Well, why don't you take it, Donnie, and then I can follow up if there's anything that I can add.
Okay, so this is an interesting question, and so when we look at the emissions reductions from cook stoves and the methodologies that are out there, so right now we typically use water boiling tests to look at emissions. Kitchen performance tests are also done, but in general, water boiling tests are done in the laboratory, and then some factors apply to the lab. We know that, or to the field. We know that this causes, there is a lot of error associated with that, but for each specific project that, for instance, if we're looking at carbon finance, if they want to to get a carbon offset, they have to actually do the tests on their stove in the field as well to get to be able to show what their emissions reduction is. I'm not certain that I'm actually getting to the answer of the question, though. Rob, I don't know if you want to add something.
Sure. So I don't know if the question is directed specifically at the numbers that we presented today, or if this is more general. So I'll answer both. If specifically for the results that I presented, we were assuming sort of best possible scenario. So we used data from a paper that was published by Jim Jeter and his colleagues. He's an EPA scientist who does stove testing. And we took we were looking at optimistic possibility, so we took the best possible emissions reductions from state-of-the-art stoves tested in lab conditions. Not realistic, okay, but we were trying to present the best possible outcome. If we were looking to, say, design a project, then, well, projects are always compromises, so oftentimes you can just pull default numbers. And if you don't use default numbers, then you carry out lab-based tests, and project methodologies allow for that. They don't demand field-based emissions testing, which is quite difficult. So projects, to my knowledge, don't use field-based emissions testing, which would be the more realistic outcome generally. And then in terms of wood consumption, you mentioned kitchen performance tests. Project methodologies allow for that, but again, they're not absolutely required. Gold standard's a little more stringent on this than the CDM. The projects I've been directly associated with tend to rely on lab-based emissions and field-based kitchen performance tests to determine wood reductions. But this is not set in stone by the methodologies. There's some flexibility.
Thank you. So at this point, I am going to bring us to a close. I want to quickly highlight that the archive of this learning session will be available on our YouTube channel, as I mentioned, along with all of our previous learning sessions. We have about 30 of them. I'll also post a recording of the session on REDD Community, and I will also post copies of the papers and studies that Rob and Charlie discussed today at reddcommunity.org, and there are a number of other REDD resources here that are great, so feel free to sign up and visit those websites if you'd like more information about those. And you can also follow us on social media. You can send me or the Forest and Climate Program here at WWF a note via email. And again, I just want to thank our presenters today, and thanks to all who attended and these great questions. And I hope to see you next time. We'll have another learning session next month as part of our monthly series. And with that, I will bring us to a close. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.